right. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Frankie Flores. I am the director of the UNM LGBTQ Resource Center. I'm excited you could be here with us today to join us for our ongoing Cafe Q series. This one is presented by Damon Carbajal. Damon Carbajal is a gay, queer, Chicanx educator, scholar, and activist from Las Cruces, New Mexico. Mr. Carbajal is currently in his second year of studies at the University of New Mexico, where he is pursuing an MA in Chicanx Studies and a certificate in Race and Social Justice. He holds a BA in Secondary Education with concentrations in Communicative and Performing Arts and a minor in Theater. He is currently the co-chair and policy coordinator for GLSEN Albuquerque and sits on the New Mexico Educational Theater Association Board and works as the operations manager at NAPPR. He is also an active member of the Teaching Out Loud PD Fellowship, the Chicanx Studies Graduate Student Organization, and the Summa Academia Innovation in Graduate Education Program. Mr. Carbajal is an alumni of the El Puente Research Fellowship and the Research Institute for Scholars of Equity, the RISE Fellowship. His research focuses on creating and maintaining equity for LGBTQ plus Chicanx students, as well as students and educators. Mr. Carvajal's MA thesis project focuses on examining mental health and school climate perceptions among LGBTQ plus Chicanx young adults. The study aims at collecting the testimonials of those living at this intersection with aims of starting a much needed conversation around mental health and how it affects New Mexico youth. Mr. Carvajal's work aims at recentering the lost voice with a focus on equity and social justice, because all students and educators deserve to have their voice not only heard, but centered. All right, Damon, take it away.
Thank you so much. Let me go ahead and share my screen. So hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm excited to share a little bit more about my thesis work now that it's done. So today's Cafe Q is entitled Mental Health, School Climate, and the Resilience of LGBTQ Chicanx Youth. And this is really the culmination of 2 years of work, starting and looking at different ways in which LGBTQ Chicanx youth survive in and out of our educational system. And then just a quick side note, today is the National Day of Silence, which is a GLSEN Day of Action that is student-led. So I want to honor GLSEN and all those students, educators, and allies who are remaining silent today. And I'm breaking my silence today by doing this presentation to sort of really understand and sort of present work that I think is really critical for creating change within our community. So starting off with a note on language. So when I proposed this Cafe Q way back in January, the title that I just named was the current conception, but I want to make a quick note of I've changed some of the language to be more inclusive of the participants' lived experiences, as well as just being more in the now of centering those voices. So LGBTQ versus LGBTQIA. For the study, I opt to use LGBTQIA+, so lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, and asexual, because this is more encompassing of my participants' lived experiences. You'll hear me use each throughout the entire presentation, but I'm referring to LGBTQIA+ throughout. And then we have Chicanx versus Mexicanx. And someone who is Mexicanx, I have defined as a person who self-identifies as Chicana, Chicano, or Chicanx, Mexicano, Mexicana, Mexicanx, Nuevo Mexicano, Nueva Mexicana, Nueva Mexicanx, Indigenous, or of mixed descent. The X is used here as a gender-neutral marker to the traditional masculine O and the feminine A, as in Mexicano, Mexicana, Mexicanx culture, and the Spanish language. And this is really done here to acknowledge that binaries are binaries, and we have a lot of folk who are gender non-binary and don't fit either the male or female binaries that are set by society. So because I come from Chicanx studies, that's why I use Chicanx studies. But really here we're looking at the different iterations of what it means to be Mexicano with these participants and the data that's going to be presented. So we have Nuevo Mexicano identified participants, Mexican American, and then some that just identify as Mexican. So I think it's really important that we're centering that here in this space to understand that this is more closely related to the lived experiences of the testimonials I'll be exploring here than utilizing the term Chicanx, Chicano, or Chicana. So what was I looking at? And I think this is really summed up in these research questions here. So first of all, what are the lived realities of LGBTQIA plus Mexicanx young adults in the context of their K through 16 schooling? And I think that's a really critical question to start asking, because we don't really know what that lived experience is in this current moment. As we'll see in a little bit with the literature that I explored, we can assume what's there, but we don't know specifically. And especially too, looking at New Mexico students and New Mexico youth overall, it's a much different experience than where a lot of our different sets of data come from. Thus, it's important that we understand the experience as a means to allow for telling and centering their voices more effectively. So to help answer this really large question more effectively, we'll be looking at two secondary questions. So what role did schooling play in their mental health? What does that relationship look like? And in what ways do their experiences with mental health shape their relationship to schooling? So really understanding this balance of education and schooling spaces do not live in a vacuum, as well as mental health. There's a lot of give and take that we need to acknowledge. Our second large question is, how do LGBTQIA plus Mexicanx young adults live out their intersectional identities, and what role do these play within their mental health? And then lastly, what queer intersectional capital do LGBTQIA plus Mexicanx young adults embody to survive and ultimately thrive in and out of the education system? Because again, you have to thrive in the education system, but that's not in a vacuum. We need to understand how we thrive in and out of different spaces. As a queer Chicanx person myself, this hits really close to home, and someone who went through all of my education thus far in New Mexico, K through my MA, I think this is really critical. And I just want to situate this statement of the problem a little bit more in terms of looking at New Mexico education is always ranked so last or second to last on many of the different scales we see. So I think just really understanding this need specifically here in New Mexico, because I think a lot of people don't understand New Mexico education. They don't understand New Mexico. They don't understand the needs here. And thus, that's why I think this project's super critical. But situating this in a larger context. So LGBTQIA plus Mexicanx youth voice is missing in K through 12 spaces. And I'm gonna argue it's also missing in a lot of K through 16 spaces as well. I'm very fortunate with the LGBTQ Resource Center and UNM AHAS to have spaces to present my work, but that's not the case in all higher ed institutions. And it's also one of those to think about as K through 16, looking more at the undergrad experience, how many students are afforded opportunities to present on the work they do that doesn't fit traditional norms of what academia is. Second, school climates are not safe or equitable for LGBTQIA students, Mexicanx students, and those who live at the intersection of being LGBTQIA and Mexicanx. It's just the sad reality, but school climate's a very big factor. And currently, it's just not a safe space for a lot of these folks. Mental health is a taboo subject in K through 12. And I argue it's a taboo subject in community as well. But specifically in K through 12, where a lot of educators are afraid to touch the subject, but it's a subject that hits so close to home. And especially in New Mexico, where we have high levels of trauma due to our student populations, both historical, past, present, local, we really need to dive into it and break this notion. Because again, when it's one of those things, if something's taboo, no one's talking about it. And then we can't provide everybody skills to combat some things that they might be going through. And then lastly, New Mexico youth experience high levels of suicidality, even higher than national averages. And this is before the pandemic, this is through the pandemic, and it just keeps continuing. And again, it goes back to these notions of we're not talking about stuff when we need to. So looking at literature, because I think we really need to embed what we're doing presently into the past and what's been done to sort of add to the conversation in a way that's effective and really just understands where we are. So one critical thing to note with the literature I'll be discussing today is there is a fair amount of literature about LGBTQIA plus students and a fair amount of literature about Mexicanx students, but there's really nothing at that intersection of both. And I think too, I also want to note that there is, I say a fair amount, there's not a lot about each, but there's enough. And I think too, another critical thing to know, when I'm talking about Mexicanx students, some of this data comes from students of color groups in different studies. So again, we're not really looking at that specific experience in a lot of this. So we're looking at general, and we're sort of imagining of what would be at this intersection if the literature currently exists. And yes, there are a couple pieces here and there, mostly from health studies that are qualitative, excuse me, not qualitative, quantitative, numerical based. Um, and that doesn't really help us sort of understand the why. So, for example, we see high rates of bullying and suicide ideation among both LGBTQI students as well as Mexicanx students. Thus, we can assume if we're imagining what this intersection would look like, it's probably for those at the intersection higher or at least the same with levels of bullying and suicide ideation. Next, we're moving into victimization. Again, high levels among both populations, but again, imagining at that intersection, it's probably even higher or the same. And then lastly, we have attitudes towards minorities. And I use the term minorities here because that is what is utilized in the literature. But in a minority majority state such as New Mexico, it's just not the best indicator when we have most of our students are Latinx, indigenous, students of color overall. Thus, not the best term, but we're going to use it because that's what the literature states. And this really takes from K through 12, K through 16, and into community spaces. And really looking at there's negative attitudes towards LGBTQI communities and Mexicanx communities overall. And this is in K through 12, college spaces, and beyond. So really thinking about how that plays into a school climate and a climate overall. For some of y'all that might not be akin to what school climate means, think about your workspace or where you're working. If you're in a space that's negative, are you going to have negative or positive implications most likely? And that's how school climate works as well. So because we have high levels of bullying and suicide ideation, high levels of victimization, and negative attitudes towards minorities for both LGBTQIA plus folk as well as BIPOC folk, this contributes to a negative school climate. And this negative school climate does not live in a vacuum. The school climate affects the holistic student, educator, and all those involved. So that's where we see mental health come in. So if you're in a space that's not the most conducive to who you are, does not respect your identity, it's going to really play into your mental health. And so example, a negative school climate most likely means negative mental health and vice versa. Because again, nothing lives in tangent, nothing's in a vacuum. It's all in a system of understanding, living, breathing, etc. So for this specific project, I opted to use mostly qualitative methods because I'm trying to fill the big gap of the why, understanding this experience of the why. And for me, numerical data, qualitative data is just a little bit more effective in doing this than quantitative data. I also feel like we have a lot of quantitative data that's indirect with these different populations, specifically from health studies. And that gives us a lot of, yes, there's high levels of bullying, there's high levels of suicide ideation, but it doesn't pinpoint the why. And as an educator, scholar, etc., the why is really how we can change practice, specifically classroom practice, but also if you're in a space where you work with youth in any capacity, community spaces, how can we create changes as well? So I opted to use a qualitative social sciences testimonial. And here I'm taking a more structured approach to testimonial methodologies. So traditionally, testimonial methodologies are collecting stories, collecting narratives. I wanted to structure mine a little bit more, i.e. the social sciences component, to ensure I'm both telling the participants' narratives in a way that is effective, holistic, and accurate, but also ensuring that I'm allowing room for policy implications. And I think that's one of the biggest things for me is it's really hard to do stuff without some sort of policy implication. Because again, funding in schooling spaces, if it's not on the books, it's going to get cut. So how can we utilize these lived experiences by both centering them and honoring them, but in a way that will create change for the future for different students? So to construct this social sciences testimonial, I have used one-on-one interviews. And these were semi-structured interviews that asked about mental health, their different social locations, their schooling experiences, etc. And then I had a demographic survey as well for each one-on-one participant. And this really asked basic information. Do you have a history of suicidality? What does your family make up? How do you identify? And this really allows me to triangulate the data and put this testimonial, the one-on-one semi-structured interview, into context. And then to even further put that into context, I've added a focus group. And this is a focus group of 5 of the 6 participants that did the one-on-one interview and the demographic survey. And they're listed here. And these are pseudonyms with their pronouns, their gender, their sexuality, and their desired career. And what I did with this focus group is now I have the participants' narratives, their testimonials. I've situated it in their specific context. And the focus group now focused on larger community things, i.e., how are LGBTQIA plus folk viewed in Chicanx communities overall? Vice versa. How does society view us as intersectional, marginalized human beings? And this really allows us to sort of understand these testimonials in the larger context. For example, we did the focus group during the height of the election. It was about September, October. Things were really heated, and that really influenced some of the things here. So I think it's critical to note that. And without sort of having this focus group to situate this, it's sort of missing. So the amazing participants, we have Rosa, Zane, Rafa, Daniel, Antonio, and Maria. And as you see, we have a variety of sexualities, genders, as well as desired careers. So yes, moving on. So the theoretical framework that I utilized for this work, and pretty much all the work I do, is critical queer theory, or queer crit. And this takes tenets of critical race theory and queer theory and puts them into conversation in a way that is unique and situational for the specific participants. And one may argue, why don't you use intersectionality alone? Because it does similar functions. And my argument here is intersectional work, this is at its heart intersectional work, but by just using intersectionality as my framework, there's often issues with skewing one identity or social location over the other, and it ends up being privileged. And this normally ends up being, I think it's done subliminally and it might be done purposely, but it's what identity or social location is more trendy in that moment for that researcher. And again, it's one of those, it's not good, or it happens. So for me, to ensure I'm doing a checks and balances in my work and to tell the participants' narratives more effectively, I like utilizing the queer crit approach because it gives me that checks and balance. Am I talking about racial factors? Am I talking about queer factors? And putting them in conversation so that experience and that intersection is really explored in a way that's effective, holistic, and true. And again, there's many, many other social locations that is not sort of taking into account with this model, but they're there. And I think this just really allows for that give and take to ensure that we are presenting testimonials effectively. So findings. So all this work, and I think this is really where it's critical to talk about findings, implications, and how we do different things in schooling spaces, community spaces, etc. So the first main theme I took away from the data was testimonials and traumas of schooling. So this is really looking at that lived experience question. What is it? So machismo and gender narratives cause negative growth in identity development. So we're taking this notion of the gender binary, machismo, toxic masculinity, machismo, and really looking at it through a microscope and understanding how these different binary conditionings, I'm going to call them, with society really have a lot of issues. Specifically if we're looking at LGBTQIA plus folk. For example, I had participants who were identified as masculine and they were told that they could not show emotion when they were younger. So just imagine you're growing up, you're a child, you can't show emotion and you're struggling with your identity in itself already. So this really causes that really big shift of, okay, what can I not do? What if I do show emotion? Is it going to cause repercussions? So again, you're always in that fight or flight mode and it doesn't allow you to really grow into your authentic self. And the same for those that are identified as femme. Yes, you might be able to show emotion, but you're always bound to these masculine ideals. You always have to have that sort of masc counterpart, which again is very problematic in terms of growing into your own self. But here, this statement is really, really, really critical for those who are non-binary, those who do not fit on this binary system in any capacity, because it really, their identity and their self and their understanding is not acknowledged in any space. So how does that allow them to grow into their true authentic self? It really doesn't. So we really need to look at sort of understanding schooling spaces and how they're perpetuating these gendered stereotypes, these binaries. And again, it's very difficult because in a lot of Latinx, Mexicanx, Chicanx communities, they're very stringent with machismo and what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, what it means to be masc, what it means to be femme, that it's very hard to do. But in schooling spaces where we can create these safer spaces for youth, how can we ensure we're creating spaces? And I'm going to even argue outside, if you have a community space that is youth-centric, how are we combating this by breaking those binaries? Next, we have ambiguity in defining mental health. And for me, came from the demographic survey. I literally asked each participant to tell me, how would you define mental health? Um, and my whole point here is none of them were able to answer it effectively. And that is no, um, what's the word I'm looking for? Bad on them, bad on anybody. It's just understanding why. If when you leave your K through 12, you can probably tell me what a sentence is at the most basic definition. And yes, I'm acknowledging mental health is a very complex entity, but there's basic factors that we need to acknowledge. For example, the term stress never appeared in any of the definitions, which is critical because at its most basic space, mental health is balances in stress, positive, negative stress, and how those play in your body. And I think too, really, what really calls into attention here is it's become so pushed to the margins. It might have got talked about once in health class, if ever, that students aren't given the tools to understand what mental health is, and then seek help if their mental health is, I'm gonna say a little wonky for lack of a better word. So if we're not providing them skills to understand that, how can they seek help when they need it? Because I bet you, if I asked each participant going back now, if they could tell me what physical health is, their definition would be more holistic because that's what you're really forced to learn. Specifically, I'm going to look at New Mexico health standards, but I'm assuming this is in other spaces as well. And then next we have words of wisdom, and this is advice to other LGBTQIA Chicanx youth, and it's all rooted in a desire for a brighter tomorrow. And my big takeaway here with this one is I really wanted to see what the participants would say in this collective space. This came out of the focus group of if you could give one piece of advice, what would you give the future youth who identifies LGBTQ and Chicanx? And each participant gave me for example, you didn't love him, but it's okay because you will keep going on. Or, for example, a participant alluded to sexual assault, but it's okay because that made me who I am. And I think really here, what really hurts me as a person and sort of I think is really interesting and really problematic is each of the words of wisdom, of advice had some sort of trauma component, but then it was flipped and reinvented to be like, yes, I went through this. I wouldn't have changed it because it made me who I am, but this is how you can avoid it. And I think that's really telling of schooling spaces and how we as queer Chicanx folk are sort of conditioned to sort of just, yes, it happened. I'm okay. Here's how to not deal with it. And I think this is a very, I don't know, it's harsh in a way, but it's also very uplifting in a way. It's a very complex notion here. And I think that's really sort of, I think this is probably one of the most telling aspects of all the work I did to sort of really get at the heart of what their schooling experience was. Because normally when you get words of wisdom, it's more positive or it's something along the lines of do this, but there was not this caveat. And I thought it really interesting that there's this caveat of trauma and it's flipped into something new. So our next main theme that I collected from ZData was Queer Chicanx Agency. So this is things that are needed, found, and created. So first, things that are needed. All the participants noted that we needed inclusive curriculum in a variety of capacities, but, oh, excuse me, I'm clicking things. But we really needed specifically, all mentioned sexual education. And from lived experience, I know this as well, the sexual education a lot of youth get is very binary. It's very this way or no way. It's very, yes, there are queer folk, but that's pretty much it, period. We don't want to talk about them. And that's really problematic. I think specifically looking at, if we're going to focus on sexual health for a minute, the implications that happen if you are not given those skills to succeed safely and to have sex safely. We have numerous studies. We know youth are having sex. We know New Mexico youth are having sex. So why are we not providing them skills to do this safely? Multiple participants noted going to the internet for answering their questions about sexual health, which we all know the internet is not the best place to learn a lot of things. And sexual health is definitely one of those, especially leading to the facts of I can't bend that way as a joke was one of the comments made during the interview. And I think that's a really got me thinking about, okay, we're joking about it, but why are we joking about it? What happened in this past that might have been sort of not as pleasant as it could have been. And thinking about too the different STIs, STDs, and who is affected at higher levels. And we often see students, not students of color, but people of color of all affected at high levels. So we need to ensure we're providing our students those skills to be safe. Because for me specifically, looking at my high school experience, the notion of contraception was taught as to not get pregnant. But for me as a person that does not have sex with femme identified folks, being a gay individual, that doesn't help me. And it's really sort of missing the fact of you're utilizing protection for the not getting STIs, STDs, etc. And I think sort of this just starts this larger conversation again about even more inclusive curriculum, health class. We're not talking about mental health. We're not talking about same-sex sexual education in any capacity. So really, what is this space and why is it there? But now jumping out of sexual education, inclusive curriculum needs to be across the board. We need to be able to, um, as Bishop stated, that windows and mirror metaphor. We should be able to see ourselves in the curriculum and the classroom, as well as be able to see through a window and see other perspectives. So thus, if we're only seeing that window, it's causing a lot of mental strain because we're not seeing ourselves, we're not seeing others like us. So for example, a lot of the individuals in the participants noted there was not much queer stuff at all. It might have got mentioned that there were queer folk in health class, and that was pretty much it. But where they did see maybe some Chicanx, Latinx, Mexicanx, was in language classes, and that was it, which is very, 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 very problematic because it needs to be across all the board. There are definitely authors who are Chicanx. There are definitely all types of folks, and we need to be embedding that in our curriculum. And again, it goes back to that norming. So we have this negative school climate and negative attitudes towards minorities, in quotes. I'm gonna put that real quick. And we're not really combating it. And if we start norming things, it's a much more important. And one of the key ways we could do this in specifically K through 12 and higher ed is through just including intersectional identities in the curriculum. And I want to caution here of not, it's not a checkbox, it's a holistic inclusion and it's never ending. We can't have diversity week and be done. We have to really embed it into all that we do as educators. We also need to embed it into our community spaces. How are we doing this in community spaces in effective ways? The second large takeaway from this main theme is things that are found. So we have this schooling space. So this is what they need. And this is something that they maybe never got in the schooling space. But now they were able to navigate this large space and find different things that help them grow into who they are. So first we see this notion of cultural production, i.e. things that are created, music, art, photography, poetry, theater, etc. The arts overall was a big component for all the individuals. And extracurriculars is really that pathway that allowed students in the K through 12 space to find these. And it's really interesting to think about extracurricular activities and who is afforded those spaces and the gatekeeping that occurs there. For example, a lot of Chicanx, Mexicanx, Latinx youth, and a lot of youth overall, but specifically this population, have a lot more commitments outside of the school day. Community commitments, they might be working, they have younger siblings they take care of, etc., etc. And it might not afford them to be in these extracurricular spaces. That's how, I'll get to in a little bit, but how can we include more arts and cultural production in the school day or in community spaces? Because it's really critical to do so. And it's really interesting here because this was a conversation that going through the one-on-one interviews, I was like, oh yeah, they're all in some sort of extracurricular or some arts in some capacity. But it didn't click to the focus group when I asked each participant to bring an item that embodied their mental health journey. That's all I said. And everybody brought a piece of cultural production or a connection to cultural production in some capacity. So these are listed below. Antonio brought this notion of poetry in general. I brought along the musical Dear Evan Hansen. Daniela brought a camera representing photography. Maria brought a poster from the movie Carol. Rosa brought a pencil drawing of a girl playing the violin in rave clothing. That's what she said. And then Zane brought this performance art piece that they do called Dancer's Release. And all of these are really important because it shows that connection from K through 12 where these were really just, I think, just a little start of getting into them. And it really exploded into different means and different things later. And how they're continuing to do this in a way that really allows them to grow who they are, grow their communities, and heal for themselves. So I think that's really, really important to know. And it's really sort of as a side note to this entire study, because we're looking at mental health and school climate more specifically, why we need arts education and why we need arts during the school day. It can't just be an after school club. It can't be an extracurricular. We need to embed it within the soul of our educational system. And then we had things that, okay, now we've looked around, we've noticed things we needed, we're able to find some spaces where we could be ourselves. But now we have to create our own spaces. Because as you know, education and all spaces are not created for multiply marginalized individuals. Education has done little changes in its inception at its heart since its creation. And it was not created for Black or brown folk. It was not created for queer folk in any capacity. So now we're taking this notion of creating spaces. So I akin these spaces that are created through a queer Resolana. And Resolana is literally a sunny side in the plaza, and it's a space of political action. And I think that's really where we're hiking it back here, is that the space of political action. And the act really here is just being your authentic self openly, which I think may not seem political to a lot, but for a lot of us whose identities have been so politicized, being open with who you are holistically is an act of rebellion. Specifically in schooling spaces where your whole being isn't might be ignored, it might be ridiculed, it might be etc. And thus we really need to talk about it. Excuse me, to get a drink. So we also see I've coined this moving of this finding this queer Resolana as third space capital. And this is a capital that's created through creating this new space. And one of the ways that we create this queer Resolana and this third space capital is through finding our chosen familia. So this is where extracurriculars come in very handy, and we see this connection here now. When you're in a space that, let's say, for example, I had 2 participants that were in band in high school. You're in that space now. You share that love of music. So you already have that one connection. And that community is now smaller than the larger schooling space. So within this space, you're able to find folks who are like you and maybe not like you, but they become your chosen familia because they are really at the heart able to sort of connect to you on a much deeper spiritual level. And it's really in these spaces that this queer Resolana occurs. Because it's very hard to be your true authentic self by yourself. You need support. It takes a village, like we all hear. And I think this is really critical here. So once you find, let's say, your chosen familia, let's say it is in a band space, this queer Resolana and third space capital is not enacted during the more formal spaces, i.e. the rehearsal, the mandated performances, etc. It happens in the liminal spaces in between. The before and after rehearsals, the breaks during rehearsal, that new connection you've made, now you go to get pizza on Friday. That's a new space that has been created out of this other entity. And it's really that now we have, so let's say schooling space, the band room's a space, a physical space, but now we're creating that third space capital and queer Resolana into that. We're moving into that political action space, which is, excuse me, which is often in K through 12 spaces. First of all, it's not the easiest thing to do. Second of all, it's hard to find chosen familia if you're not in extracurriculars. For example, if you just do your K through your day, your 7:30 to 2:30 for whatever reason, whether that be you want to, you have other commitments, etc. Outside of quick passing periods and lunch spaces, you're not really afforded a lot of time to find your peoples, to find your chosen familia. Thus, that's why extracurriculars are a great way for it to occur. And this is why I really argue that there's a lot of students, again, like I mentioned earlier, do not have access to extracurriculars and to other entities that are outside of the normal, let's say high school 7:30 to 2:30 school day. So how can we ensure we're providing them spaces during that time? Because there's more than enough time to teach whatever we need to teach, provide them the spaces to do this, where they could really find their chosen familia. And for if it's a queer Chicanx group of folks, enact queer Resolana, and if it's another group, enact third space capital to really be who they are. So our last major theme that we'll be looking at specifically for this presentation is called healing traumas, and this is fruits of healing for themselves and others. So we know that schooling spaces are not the most effective. There's trauma, re-embedding a trauma, it happens. Now, how do we heal and grow from those? And I think this is really the power in this work. So trauma is prevalent among LGBTQI and Chicanx youth. And this ranges from a lot of different traumas, from physical, emotional, sexual, etc. And again, I this is not the trauma Olympics. We're not who has the most trauma wins or who has the less trauma wins. It's just understanding that trauma is relevant, and also understanding that different folks interpret, interact, and heal from trauma in different ways. So again, understanding that trauma is not just this notion; it's a very fluid idea that we need to work with. And one of the ways that the participants combated trauma was through taking on parental or leadership roles. And going back to our notions of being able to define mental health and having that notion of stress and understanding that there's positive stress, negative stress, and how that balance works is really where this becomes, I think, really interesting, because this is a thing that they can combat trauma very effectively, but it can also flip on its head if we're diving into that negative stress and then having too much of that. So, for example, we had one participant who was the oldest of five siblings. So they took on the role of being that parental figure in different spaces. And this allowed them to really ensure that they were able to allow their siblings to have a little bit more, I'm going to say, shielded of an upbringing than they did. One very specific instance from the interview was discussing it's 3 in the morning, our parents are fighting, and this individual getting up and taking their younger siblings for a walk so they don't have to experience this loud violence that's occurring. Um, and in that moment, it might feel for them as it feels good that they're getting them out of there, they're shielding them from that. But also, let's take into account having to, you're 15 years old, take on that responsibility. How does that really counteract with our negative and positive stress and the mental psyche that mental toll, not psyche, mental toll that takes on individuals. Um, so just taking that into account, and then also thinking about if you have to be this strong individual all the time, because this is a mask identified queer person, and you're not allowed to show emotion as defined by the binaries. It builds up, and as I saw with the interview and the rest of the ranger, that's really the source of a lot of the mental um, challenges that they were going through. But again, for them in that moment, it's healing, and that's really critical. And then on the flip side, now taking it from the home space into the schooling space, we had one individual who went to a charter school, a charter high school that was focused on Mexican American ideologies, folks, etc. So that part of their curriculum was there, but the queerness was not there. And the homophobia, transphobia, queerphobia was very rampant due to some of the religious undertones of being in this community and this space as it was created. So they opted, because they saw they were the only out queer kid in their class. But then they noticed in their senior year that there was more folks who were being open with who they were, but there was no space for them to be their true authentic selves. Thus, they went through the process of getting a GSA. During that time, it was a gay straight alliance. Now we see gender sexuality alliance is more the normed use of that acronym for these younger folks. So again, it's taking on that leadership role of I'm going to be gone next year, so I can't shield you, but here's a new created space where that can happen. And again, this is one of those that's very positive, and yes, it's helping community. But thinking the positive versus negative stress balance again, if you're going to be that open, you're going to start this space in a space that's already hostile to your being. How does that play into your mental toll? How does that play into that positive versus negative stress balance that we all have to go through? But I think really important here is I'm playing sort of devil's advocate and looking at sort of the mental health spectrum and the positive versus negative stress. But for the participants in this moment, it was all healing. It was all positive. And this is how they combated their trauma. And I think it's one of those things that, and we all do this, it's until you sort of reflect back, and even you might never realize that it was not the most healing space truly, but that's okay, because we all have to grow and become who we are. And I think just understanding sort of these different systems and cycles is essential. And this is really where transcending trauma capital comes in. And this is the act of taking trauma from your past, your present, learning from it, growing from it, and using it to light a fire to create change. And I think this is really, really powerful, specifically because this is something a lot of us do that come from intersectional backgrounds that are viewed as lesser in various spaces. And we always see in academia, in different spaces, yes, it's traumatic. Yes, this is negative. Yes, this is what happens. Yes, there's bullying. But we don't really understand that growth that occurs from that. Because no matter how screwed up it is, for lack of a more academic way of saying it, um, we're going to go through trauma. It's just, we live in a system of systems that is so hard to break. Um, so we need to acknowledge that, yes, we have gone through this, but we can make it through. We can change it. We can flip it on its head and make it something positive. So, for example, the individual who took on that parental role with their siblings, they enacted transcending trauma capital by taking what happened in their younger self and saying, you know what, I don't want this to happen for my siblings anymore. So I'm gonna get them out of there. And that is for a 15-year-old to put those connections together and really know what to do quickly is powerful. Or for example, taking on this leadership role in the schooling, starting that GSA space. This was their senior project. So it's 3 years of negative school climate, and some of the stuff they told me was highly negative. It fits very aligned with the bullying, the victimization, the violence, and really sort of taking that pain at its heart, changing it, mashing it into something new. And it really, they kept stating in their interview, this was Zane, that I just have an overconfidence issue. And I don't think it's an overconfidence issue. I think it's the growth and the fire that's lit through taking the past traumas and enacting transcending trauma capital. And I think it's really, really, really important to sort of name this and sort of tell folks that you are not just overconfident. You are enacting and growing and healing in a way that's super, super, super effective. So where does queer intersectional capital come from? Because it's not my own little brainchild. I'm introducing some new ones, but let's take a moment to acknowledge where this comes from. So first we have community cultural wealth, and this was introduced in YOSO in 2005, specifically looking at Latinx populations in different spaces. So here we have that sort of the Latinx Mexicanx component, but it's not queer. And the sixth capital YOSO introduced are aspirational capital, familia capital, social capital, navigational capital, resistant capital, and linguistic capital. And these are all enacted in different spaces. But it's not queer, so that's missing a big part of our experience. So now we take into account the queer cultural capital on the bottom left here, and this was introduced by Pinnell in 2015. And they introduced, to queer the capital model, transgressive capital. And this is a capital of moving past something. And I think for me, it's harder for youth to move past things due to a variety of factors, resources, being under the age and being in a space where maybe familia is not the most accepting, and it just there's a lot more barriers. So I want to introduce queer intersectional capital, QIP, specifically transcending trauma capital and third space capital. That is more youth LGBTQ Mexicanx focused. So now we're understanding that this is, yes, a more youth-centric lens, but all of us enact these in different spaces. And yes, there were participants who use transgressive capital, but it's not going to happen as much. And I just think here to just noting it as queer cultural capital is really missing that intersectional lived experience that is so critical to this work. And I think here on this model I've created, we have cultural wealth in the middle, so that's the really heart of everything. And then we have all these different scholars, theories, perspectives outside with these light pink arrows connecting them. Because some participants used all of these on here. Some used a couple from each, and they don't live in vacuums. Like I've been saying, we all live in sort of different spaces, and specifically cultural wealth, queer cultural capital, community cultural wealth, and QIP don't live in vacuums. They all work and play with each other. And it's just important to note that, yes, you also introduced this, but now we need to build on it. We need to intersectionalize it. We need to understand that queer point of view of it. And there's a lot of folks and a lot of scholars who are doing this type of work. And also, there's a lot of folks who are out of the academy that are doing this work. And I think it's really, really critical to note that. QIP and Queer Intersectional Capital, we're looking here in the academic space, our ivory tower, for lack of a better term, but we saw the use of transcending trauma capital in all of our ancestors, on all those who allow me to be where I am today, and all the others in this space with marginalized identities and social locations. Because there's no way, if you just go through trauma and sort of live in that trauma, that you're gonna be able to flip it and switch it and really sort of internalize it in a way that helps for growth. And I think we really see this a lot with the HIV/AIDS pandemic that happened in the 80s and 90s. This was such a terrible thing that happened, but we have all these folks who it happened, they grew from it, and they really created that change. And we see it in different spaces as well. But that's just the first one that comes to mind of, if we just stopped as a community, we wouldn't be where we are today. And then third space capital, for example, the act of creating spaces in spaces is not new. I'm thinking specifically ballroom culture is another one that comes straight to mind of, this is a space within a space, but it's a space of political action for being who you are, and a space to be your holistic self. So intervention. So why does it matter? And I think this is a little bit of my soapbox, but I think it's really important. So Danielle stated, I didn't find out until I tried killing myself that there was mental health issues in my family. These words were uttered to me in September of last year, and they still, every time I read it, every time I think about it, it hurts me, because it really shows the lack of skills, lack of knowledge, and lack of care overall that we are providing to our youth in specifically educational spaces, but also community spaces. No one should get to this point because they should be able to have the tools to help them. So we as a community of scholars, educators, community members, parents, siblings, everybody need to create change for the most marginalized in our communities. And in honor of the Day of Science from GLSEN, we often say at GLSEN, creating a safer school for creating a safer school for LGBTQI students is creating a safer school for all. And I'm arguing here, creating a safe space for the most marginalized in your community is creating a safer space for all. Because if we're allowing those who live with multiple marginalized social locations to heal, thrive, and grow, all of us will learn, grow with them. So I'm gonna real quick look at CCS as a discipline. That's where I'm from. I'm in Chicanx studies right now. And this is a space that I think is unique, ethnic studies overall, but CCS specifically, because it allows for healing to occur. It allows for that understanding, but we're not really allowing all to heal yet in this space. And again, we're bound by systems. It's a discipline. So how can we really understand and create spaces for all to heal? And this is the same with education. And I think education is even a little further behind the curve with Chicana studies, CCS, because we're not providing spaces for all. We're providing spaces for some. And as we see with the educational history, there's waves of things that come through and are sort of centered, and then it kind of goes away. So how do we enact intersectionalisms into our lives? Curriculums, community spaces, educational spaces. So let's take a quick moment to revisit the research questions, sort of understand major takeaways. So what are the lived realities of LGBTQIA+ Mexicanx young adults within K through 16 schooling? And this is sort of answering this with the sub-questions. It's negative. It's filled with trauma. It is not conducive to learning, and it needs to be better. And I think we really have to take a hard look at the truth before we can make change. And that's why I say that very bluntly. It's not a great space, but it can be, but it's not yet. So number 2, how do LGBTQIA+ Mexicanx young adults live out their intersectional identities, and what role do these play within their mental health? So for one example, we see this notion of things created, found, and needed. Cultural production is so critical with this participant group. And I know that cultural production, as well as there's other entities that really help them do that. Chosen familia is also a really critical thing here. Finding your folks to be your true whole self. And connecting this second one too with cultural action for me, I did theater, I did band, and it's really has been sort of a lifeline. I still do things today, not as much as I did in high school, but it's healing, it's therapeutic. And it's something that arts are, especially in Chicanx, Mexicanx cultures, it's in our blood to do cultural production, music, art. It's all very who we are. And because mental health is and healing, not really healing, but mental health more is so taboo, if we can sort of mask healing in a way that is more community accepted, which is a really not great thing to say, but it's something we have to do to sort of live in the system. It allows for more healing to occur. And for example, if someone writes a song that is healing, that's combating trauma, it's not viewed as clinical, and it really helps create new change because it's more viewed as acceptable with society. It helps really break stigma, and it's through sort of these little intricacies that we can sort of breaking things apart that the stigma mental health can truly stop. And again, it's one of those, it's going to take a long time, but little changes here and there. And then lastly, we have what queer intersectional capital do LGBTQI plus Mexicanx young adults embody to survive and ultimately thrive in and out of the educational system. So we have the six that were presented by Yoso, some transgressive capital, but I argue at the heart it's transgressive trauma capital and third space capital. These are really our youth, queer, Chicanx centric um, modes of capital that are intersectional in conception and really acknowledge that whole self. So recommendations, because like I said earlier, if we're not sort of pushing our work to extend outside of the toxic ivory tower, and yes, I say toxic very pointedly, it's not doing any help. So policy implications, mental health resources are needed. In a game of education politics, funding is always an issue, but that's beside the point. We need to figure out how to do this. I argue first we need more mental health specific folks, social workers, counselors, therapists in schooling spaces, but also that might not be possible right now. So how can we, for example, as an educator, just put maybe a community resource wall in your room? If you're a community space, having flyers and stuff for different mental health resources. Because again, a lot of things, especially with youth, they might not know these existed. And for me as a person, I was not in the know about nothing in K through 12. It wasn't until I got to college and I was like, I'm missing so many opportunities in different spaces that could have helped me. So just really there. And this is really a policy implication because until it's on the books, it's not going to happen. There's going to be some great educators and administrators here and there, but we need it everywhere. Next, we need inclusive curriculums on the books. Again, inclusive curriculum has been one of those things that we have argued and argued and argued forever, it feels like, in education. But we need inclusive, deliberate, intersectional curriculum that's on the books. We need to move past the hero and holidays models that we often see. And again, it's one of those, unless it's on the books, it's going to get cut. Ethnic studies classes in K through 12 are critical. They're far and few in between, and the ones that do appear often go away very quickly because of the lack of funding. But if it's on the books is required, it's going to stay. Lastly, representation matters. So where are the LGBTQIA Mexicanx educators? This is a call for both districts, principals, those hiring, but as well as our teacher preparation programs. And sort of, we need to do more to recruit students who are of different backgrounds. The educational pool of teachers is largely white and female, and that's due to a long historical past with education. But we really need to provide students role models who look like them, give them that mirror, because we're needed. And I think also too, just with hiring, with recruitment, etc., looking at intersectional identities. Don't say, oh, they're queer, checkbox, they're in, done. No, we need to have color in our LGBTQness. We need to have queerness in our Mexicanness, and vice versa, and etc. So some policy implications, and I'm going to extend these from classroom to community spaces. Chosen familia and the classroom. Like I stated earlier, not all folks and students can be involved in extracurriculars. So how can we embed that in our classrooms or community spaces? And I want this to be done intentionally. It's not just a create group projects all year and people will find each other. No, it has to be done intentionally. But it does providing space to just let people talk. We often get in spaces as educators where we have to have every minute so planned out. But what's wrong with giving students 5 minutes to talk with folks they want to? There's nothing. Community building. Enacting intersectional curriculum. So even if we get inclusive curriculum on the books, we have to make sure as educators and community members that it's intersectional, because what ends up on the books is not going to be intersectional, and not just because of the way laws work and gatekeeping and policy. So how can we ensure being intersectional? And this is something we can all do tomorrow. And I think it's really understanding that, yes, we need to include LGBTQA, we need to include BIPOC, we need to include et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But we need to look at those intersections and not just sort of say this is our queer week or our queer author. If you're talking about the sexuality of one author, I'm in English concentration, you need to talk about the sexuality of all your other authors. And that's just one example of, I think, teachers not even realizing the othering that they're doing. And then lastly, we need to do trauma responsive pedagogy and trauma informed practices. And I've included both here because trauma responsive pedagogy is aiding in that healing process. And then trauma informed practices are really just being in the know about trauma and how your interactions can be triggering again. And I include both here because for a schooling space, I argue trauma responsive is more effective, and that's pedagogy, so that's the heart of it. But you might be a community member that works with youth that might not be able to have all those tools. So just utilizing trauma-informed practices in your work. And again, this is a process and a learning process. And if you start with trauma-informed practices as an educator, and then you can move into trauma-responsive pedagogy, that's really critical and really important. So that's something really here with this last point. I just want to ensure we're all doing this together in an effective way. So to close out my presentation, I'm going to leave you with this. In honor of those who no longer live and those who fight the battle of survival daily, what can you do to ensure our LGBTQIA+ Chicanx youth not only live but thrive? Thank you very much. And I'm going to stop sharing screen and we'll see if there's any questions.
Thank you, Damon. So on our Facebook, we don't necessarily have any questions, but we do have some comments. So we have 2 comments from Dr. Carson Morris saying, thanks for this excellent talk. Yes, let's reframe sexual education. And then she quoted you on when you said machismo and gendered narratives cause negative growth in identity development. We have another comment from Richard Pierce saying you are amazing. And then the last comment is from Irene Vasquez saying excellent presentation. I appreciate the notion that healing may occur in different spaces, not only student services unit.
Yeah. Thank you all that made those comments. I think it's really important. I think too, as a education CCS scholar, we often get caught up in it classroom practice, but I think just reminding folks that this can be used in every space, and it should be in every space, because we as community members, I think all have a responsibility to not only help each other, but especially our youth who are growing and thriving and really deserve the same opportunities as each other, and that we did not have, and hope to have.
Thank you. And actually, I have a question for you. What are some strategies or ways that teachers and educators can really put what you talked about in praxis? Like, what is the best way that they can do that?
Yes, and it's really complex, but I think at its heart, and this could be done in every space, is allowing students to, first of all, select what they want to do in a capacity. So for example, if you're doing an assignment, allow students to sort of take a push. Maybe they want to research LGBTQI stuff. Yeah, excuse me, LGBTQI topics. Let them. And I think as educators, we often get stuck in the, are we going to get in trouble? Is this going to look bad? Are we going to get parent complaints? So just being open to being a true ally and not just someone who's scared all the time of your job. Because for me, I think too, and that's, I know scary to say, but I think that's really important. And again, there's very fine lines that you play in education with acknowledging, understanding, and exploring identity specifically, but there's a way we can do it all effectively, respectfully, and honoring the students. And I think that's another big thing too for me is to put it directly into practice, just being really aware of the lessons you are teaching, of the content you are teaching. So, for example, for me as an English teacher, if I am going to teach a novel that has a sexual assault scene, and I don't think twice about how that could be re traumatizing or cause more trauma, is very problematic. And no, I'm not saying we should not talk about it. Dear Evan Hansen's the text that I brought for the focus group that deals with mental health, that deals with divorced parents, that deals with suicide. But it's how you present it and how you ensure that you're providing the tools to succeed. I think also too, like I said earlier, I am a big fan of creating a community resource wall in your classroom. This is something that takes literally find some resources, put them out, tap them up, it's done. And even too, if you're in higher ed and you have an office space, putting stuff out for students to see. If your department lets you, putting up a bulletin board with resources. And these are all things that does not take a lot of time. And those students who really need it are going to seek it out. That's another thing. I think a lot of us are scared. Oh, we're putting resources about mental health and suicide in the back corner. It's going to cause some havoc. No, it's just there for when it's needed. So those are some of my initial thoughts. And I think it's really complex too, just because different spaces and different schooling things are all run differently. But I think too, just honoring the student and really just being a ally for the student. Because in the end, if you have to stand up to your administration or another colleague and you are supporting a student, that's going to reflect on you positively. And there's nothing wrong when you're supporting a student. And again, bold words, and it's not the easiest to do, especially in political schooling spaces, but I think it's what we have to do.
Thank you. So it looks like we don't have any other questions, but is there anything that you'd like to say? Anything you'd like to discuss further about what you talked about?
Yeah, so I can just close it off real quick then. Just first of all, thank you to everybody that was here and anybody that gets to do this after. Um, this work is really critical to me. It hits very close to home. And I just want to thank the UNM AHAS, the LGBTQ Resource Center, as well as my thesis committee and department for letting me do this work and do this work really in a way that feels healing for me. And I hope it's healing for others as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Damon. So I just want to say that for folks watching or who will be watching in the future, we do have one more Cafe Q on April 30th with Luis Esparza. And before finals week, we will be having a Cholo Goth night. So I hope you can join us, and you can find us on Facebook at UNM Ahas or on Instagram as well. Thank you.